Thank you, Marty. I will get straight into it as I'm very sure that everyone is excited as I am to listen to our presenter today. My name is Ingrid Cox and I'm the current president of the chapter. Our student chapter is part of the Asia Pacific region of chapters. And in Australia, there are currently 3 student chapters, one at Newcastle, Sydney, which was just started in June of this year, and the Victoria and Tasmania student chapter. There is also a regional Australia chapter in Australia as well. So our chapter was conceptualized by Professor Nancy Devlin, who's our speaker today, and Dr. Cohen Degelig, one of our faculty advisors. Our chapter is a collaboration between 4 universities, Deakin, Monash, University of Melbourne, and University of Tasmania. And our current executive officially started in April of this year. So the objectives of our chapter are to provide an environment where students can share knowledge. We also want to serve as a bridge in bringing together students from different disciplines and persons already working in health economics and outcomes research. Additionally, we want to act as a resource for new students in the field of health economics and outcomes research and provide opportunities for student chapter members to become more familiar with ISPOR and also provide them with opportunities to build their professional and leadership skills. Our current chapter executive comprises of 4 PhD students from 4 unis. Martin, who you met earlier, is our secretary and from University of Melbourne. Tan Nguyen, our treasurer, is from Deakin University. Kate Bailey is our vice president and she's from Monash University, and myself from University of Tasmania. And in this year of our tenure, our focus is mainly on creating a solid base and systems to ensure sustainability of the chapter. We work closely with 4 faculty advisors, Dr. Julie Campbell from the University of Tasmania, Associate Professor Zanfina Delany from Monash University, Dr. Mary Lou Chatterton from Deakin University, and Dr. Cohen Degelig from University of Melbourne. We have also established 3 subcommittees, which is made up of 14 students from all 4 universities. And each of these subcommittees is focused on specific tasks linked to the objectives of the chapter. Since we started, we have had a few achievements. We established our chapter constitution. We have established social media platforms with the work of the communication subcommittee, which is chaired by Marty. We are in the process of developing a chapter website. As mentioned, we established 3 subcommittees. We are in the process of planning for our student chapter symposium next year. It may be virtual, dependent on our situation currently. We have established a student chapter communication strategy and plan, and our team has the opportunity of reporting for the Values and Outcomes Spotlight at the Asia Pacific, ISPOR Asia Pacific Conference, which is next week. We would like to encourage students from all levels interested in health economics and research, outcomes research, to sign up to our mailing list, and also to follow activities and progress by our social media platforms. You can also contact any of the executive members for more information via our email account. And for now, we will continue with our presentation by Professor Nancy Devlin. Professor Nancy Devlin is the current director of the Center for Health Policy at the University of Melbourne and has previously served as the Director of Research at the Office of Health Economics in London, and has honorary professorships at the School of Health and Related Research at the University of Sheffield and City University. With over 30 years of international experience in research, and as an advisor to healthcare organizations, both in the public and private sectors, she's highly regarded internationally as a presenter and as an educator. She has extensive experience in senior leadership and governance roles in academic and healthcare organizations, such as the past president of ISPOR and the past president of the Eurocorp Group. So without further ado, I'm gonna welcome Professor Nancy Devlin to start with her presentation. Welcome, Nancy.
You're still on mute, Nancy.
There we go. How's that?
Fantastic.
I failed Zoom 101. Oh, thank you so much for inviting me to come and speak with you all today. It's so exciting that you've managed to successfully establish your chapter. So congratulations to you all, and particularly to your leaders, to Ingrid, Tan, Marty and Kate. Absolutely great to see. So really, really pleased to be here. And I should say I'm actually in New Zealand at the moment, so I should begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm currently on, which is in southern New Zealand, and that's the Ngāi Tahu Māori tribe. In this beautiful part of the world. So when I was asked to speak today, I was invited to talk to you a little bit about health economics and HEOR and what the role of ISPOR is, rather than to talk to you about any of the research that I do. So that's what I'm going to speak to you about today. And it was really interesting having to think this through. So thanks for inviting me to talk about this. So I'm going to just very quickly go over some thoughts about health economics as a sub-discipline of economics and the definition of HEOR, and then talk about the role of ISPOR and what differentiates it from other professional associations that are active in this area. And then I'm going to talk about some recent developments at ISPOR, particularly around scientific strategy and a few other things that are important that are going on and that you might want to be aware of and that you might be able to contribute to as a chapter. And then I'm just going to finish just with some reflections as the past global president of ISPOR. And those are kind of reflections on leadership roles. And anyway, I hope it's of interest to you. Really happy to take questions. And I think everyone can do that in the Q&A function, and then Kate will pick up on that at the end. So without further ado, here we go. So yeah, just to begin with thinking about health economics and how that fits in with the definition of HEOR, because HEOR is kind of the sweet spot for ISPOR. It's what ISPOR is all about. Health economics, I imagine that most of you on this call are doing or have done postgraduate degrees or studies in health economics, and so you know quite a bit about it at this stage. I think it's just worth saying that health economics takes economic theory, modeling methods, empirical techniques from economics more broadly, and thinking about the way that markets work or don't work, as the case may be, in healthcare, and endeavour to understand what drives the decision-making by individuals, providers, and how we can support and enhance the decision-making by government bodies with respect to health and healthcare. Obviously, economics as a whole is a social science, and we all know it's about how you make choices when you're confronted with scarcity. And we argued it in this book, and I've argued it in a couple of other papers, that health economics is an enormously successful sub-discipline of economics, and arguably one of its most impactful in terms of our influence on policy and practice and the way in which decisions are made in the healthcare sector, and the way that health technology appraisal in particular routinely draws upon health economics methods and evidence. So a really exciting field to work in, because you do have that sense that the work that you do has a really direct bearing on real decisions that are being made out there in the world. So if you're studying health economics, Great choice. And careers continue to be really buoyant. The demand for health economists continues to grow, and I think will continue to grow, particularly as more healthcare systems around the world shift toward universal coverage and collective funding, and this generates a demand for the skills of health economists to help to inform the kind of decisions that are required in those kind of healthcare systems. So over recent years, obviously, we've seen China and Mexico and India as well, making inroads toward collective funding of healthcare and kind of socialized healthcare systems, not the US, obviously. So that's health economics, and you probably know quite a bit about that already. What about the OR part of HEOR? Well, it stands for outcomes research, not operations research. So I have heard a lot of people say that HEOR is health economics and operations research. And operations research sort of draws upon mathematics and a set of advanced analytical techniques, some of which we actually use as part of HEOR. But the OR in HEOR really stands for outcomes research, and it draws upon a very wide range of disciplines. So the OR part of HEOR is multidisciplinary by definition, and is focused on the identification and measurement of outcomes in the healthcare sector. So HEOR is kind of the combination of these two things. And I thought it would be, I've never done this before actually, so it was a good exercise for me to go back to this diagram and to think where HEOR fits in here. I don't know how many of you have seen this before. If you've studied health economics, you probably have, but this is what's called Alan Williams' plumbing diagram, and you can just Google that. Alan Williams was one of the leading early figures in health economics, and he came up with this diagram, which we still use today in our teaching of health economics. And it just tries to illustrate what health economists do and what the principal topics are that we're concerned with. And it really spans everything, that it sits within economics. That is how markets function and operate, what determines the supply of healthcare, what determines the demand for healthcare, how is an equilibrium achieved, where do markets work, where do markets fail, what influences health other than healthcare, so the determinants of health, and then how do we define and measure health, how do we evaluate specific interventions, and then how does all of that fit together at a system level. And so I was looking at this when I was thinking about the definition of HEOR, and I was thinking, okay, so the HE bit of HEOR, how does it fit in here? Because HEOR doesn't cover everything in health economics. I think it's kind of a subset of it. So I think arguably, a lot of the focus of health economics and outcomes research is really here in the microeconomic evaluation level. Effectiveness, relative effectiveness, cost effectiveness, and cost benefit analysis. And of course, nowadays we really focus on cost effectiveness analysis and relatively rarely do cost benefit analysis of healthcare. So our standard techniques tend to be in terms of incremental cost per QALY gained, for example. And this kind of economic evaluation is a huge focus in HEOR because we're interested in understanding whether treatments, and often it's new treatments, new technologies, whether they work, how effective they are relative to existing treatments. So there's that relative or comparative effectiveness is super important. And then obviously, because we're economists, we're also interested in what the incremental cost is of those new treatments, and then weighing up the costs and benefits, whether or not these things are good value for money relative to what we have to sacrifice elsewhere in the healthcare system in order to afford them. So that's a big focus of the HE part of HEOR. But because of our interest in that, I think B is also really important in HEOR. And health economists have been asking these questions for years. What do we mean by health? What is its value? What does value mean in healthcare systems? And how might we measure this? It's really interesting to see how health economics has evolved over the years. I started studying health economics back in, the late 1970s. And at that stage, people were still arguing that health was an intangible and couldn't be measured. And subsequent to that, we started developing measurements, compartmentalized measurements or standardized patient-reported outcome questionnaires to try and systematically measure what was important to patients in terms of health and how we could link outcomes to the delivery of healthcare. I'm sure there's still a long way to go in terms of improving measurement of what health is and how it can be valued. And as well as that, I guess HEOR is a little bit concerned with some other things in the diagram here. So for example, while mostly HEOR has been concerned with new health technologies, the new costly drugs, the surgical techniques and other things that, evolve. And part of HEOR, I suspect, was sort of developed in part, to sort of manage demand and manage costs in healthcare systems. But I think increasingly people are recognizing that you can't just focus on what's happening at the margin. And that when you're looking at new technologies that increase costs but improve outcomes, they have an opportunity cost elsewhere in the healthcare sector. They have a budget impact, and we need to understand what those opportunity costs are, and we need to understand how that impacts on allocative efficiency overall. So I think one of the really promising areas that HEOR is moving into is not just focusing on microeconomic evaluations of individual technologies, but really trying to understand HEOR at a whole system perspective. What does allocative efficiency look like across the whole healthcare system? What does technical efficiency look like within that healthcare system? What does a fair distribution of health and healthcare look like? So how does equity come into it? And because of that, we're also kind of then, getting involved with payers. We're talking about health economics assisting in a really practical way with planning, budgeting, monitoring, and routine evaluation. And I suppose we should also say, particularly when it comes down to using HEOR to evaluate value for money. Of course, value for money and looking at value for money is also used in terms of negotiating prices in reimbursement processes. So understanding how prices are set, understanding how reimbursement of healthcare producers, the life sciences industry, links to incentives is also in there as well. So I don't think we can say that HEOR is interested in everything within health economics, but it does have a very strong interest in these kind of subsets of it. In terms of thinking about how HE and OR combine, I went back and had a look at what ISPOR says about this. So I had to go look up the definition to see what they say. And they reinforce the idea that HEOR is involved with providing and evaluating a range of economic and outcomes data. And there's a real focus again on understanding alternatives and how alternative choices with respect to healthcare delivery impact on outcomes and then might influence different stakeholders. And in its application in HEOR, that health economics focuses on measuring and valuing outcomes. And I suppose that's not just outcomes gained, but outcomes forgone. And then in terms of the OR part, that outcomes research comprises a set of scientific disciplines. So it brings in clinical people, public health expertise, social and social sciences elements to research in order to evaluate the effect of healthcare interventions. And that might be in terms of clinical endpoints, or it might be in terms of more economically defined outcomes, such as QALYs, for example. So the conduct of outcomes research is not just health economics, it brings in epidemiology, the analysis of real world data, which draws on a whole other set of skills as well, and draws on things like patient-reported outcomes, biostats, clinical studies, systematic reviews, and meta-analyses. So all of this is really about the generation of evidence to improve decision-making. Sorry about the really basic diagram here, but again, it was my little way of trying to think, how does all this fit together? And I think what I'm trying to get at with this diagram is that there's this sort of big field of health economics. And as I said, not all of health economics, I think, is within HEOR, but some of it is. And then there's a big field of operations research, a lot of which sits within HEOR. And HEOR is very distinctly multidisciplinary, drawing on both the multiple disciplines that sit within outcomes research and health economics. And also, I think there is this sort of distinct, although outcomes research has its own distinct set of disciplinary approaches, such as psychometrics, for example, I think there is a distinct overlap between outcomes research and health economics that sits within HEOR. And I'm thinking there particularly around how we value health outcomes and what the utilities are for health-related quality of life that we use for estimating QALYs and so on. So I'm kind of interested if you have any thoughts on this diagram. I just sort of made it up quickly this morning. And to be honest, I'm sort of a little bit unsure as to whether outcomes research should just entirely overlap with HEOR or whether there are aspects of outcomes research that sit outside HEOR's focus. And I need to think about that a little bit more. So I haven't got all the answers here. Okay, just to say a few things about the shifting on to ISPOR, what ISPOR is, and what its role and remit is. I'm hoping that everybody on this call is going to get really actively engaged with the ISPOR, your new ISPOR student chapter. So what makes it distinctive and how is it different from other professional associations in this space? So what makes ISPOR distinctive? Well, first of all, its focus, I guess. Its focus is really on HEOR. So that's why I've been going on about the definition. So promoting the use of HEOR, but also developing HEOR science is kind of the whole mission of ISPOR. So encouraging the use of the techniques which are already there, but also trying to really push the frontiers out with HEOR science. And you can see that through best practice task forces, the task force reports that you see published in Value in Health, and also special interest groups. And I'd really encourage you to go and look at the special interest groups actually, because as members of the student chapter, you can, be part of those special interest groups that focus in on different aspects of HEOR and try to push that science forward. The other thing that makes ISPOR distinctive as an organisation is its scale and its reach. Its scale is incredible, really. It's 20,000 members globally, which is phenomenal. It's a huge organisation. And that includes, obviously, the members of ISPOR International, but we've also got the country chapters, the regional chapters, the student chapters, and so on. So its reach globally is extraordinary. And I think what's really good about that is how active ISPOR is in the lower and middle income countries in particular. And a huge proportion of ISPOR's spending, its mission critical spending, is actually in lower middle income countries. I think it's over 40% actually of ISPOR's mission critical spending is in the development of HEOR systems and processes and the support of health technology appraisal in countries. And I'm sort of really proud of that because ISPOR is obviously a not-for-profit organisation. And so helping to promote HEOR around the world is a big part of what it's there to do. It's also got a really unique, deep and broad engagement with a wide range of stakeholders. So health technology appraisal bodies, for example. So NICE in the UK, PBAC, all around the world, these HTA bodies are really engaged with ISPOR, and ISPOR runs HTA roundtables in parallel with all of its big conferences. And I'm really lucky to have gotten to sit around the table at those meetings. Not everybody is invited. They're not open meetings. It's only to get all of the HTA bodies sitting around the table, and they have a really candid discussion about their methods for engaging with HTA, how they use evidence, where the gaps in evidence are, how evidence should be improved, and where methods need to be improved. They're amazing meetings, and all of that stuff feeds into the task forces, the special interest groups, and so on. Similarly with regulators, so ISPOR is not just concerned with HTA bodies, but also with regulators. So there's a very deep engagement with the FDA, for example, in the US, and with the European Medicines Agency and similar regulatory bodies in other regions. Increasingly, payers are getting involved, and this is something I've been really encouraging as well. HTA bodies are super important. So, for example, NICE is really important, but NICE is effectively acting as an agent for the healthcare system, which is the NHS in the UK. And we would really, I think we really need to have the NHS around the table as well. Similarly, in Australia, we're interested in PBAC and helping PBAC and the methods that they use, that, you know, that they're strengthened and at the forefront. But similarly, you know, we would really want to have some engagement with the payers, the budget holders in the Australian healthcare system as well. Patients are another really important stakeholder group, and there's a patient roundtable that meets in every region and that has a big meeting in parallel to the other ISPOR meetings. Of course, academics are there as well, and the life sciences industry shouldn't be forgotten about as well. They find ISPOR a really interesting forum to find out what the changes in methods are that they should be using to generate evidence, to submit to HTA bodies, to submit to payers, and to understand what value to patients and healthcare systems really means. And so bringing together all of those stakeholders is a really important role that ISPOR has. And as an academic researcher, I find it really useful to understand where all of these different groups are coming from, because they're all interested in different aspects of the evidence. And then finally, the other thing that makes ISPOR distinctive, and I've found sort of useful as an organisation, is its influence and its impact. And it has that through having education as a really key aspect of what ISPOR is there for. If you go to the ISPOR conferences, which of course will probably be virtual or at the very least hybrid for a long time, I think, you will see that there are short courses there that you can take part in. They're a really useful way of complementing the formal academic training that you will have done. And there's also the best practice task force reports and just publications generally. So value and health regional issues, and so forth. So I'll say a little bit more about all of that, but I'll also talk about how ISPOR's remit is different from other organisations as well. So just briefly to say about ISPOR's mission, you can see that on its website. It's to really promote HEOR excellence and to improve decision-making globally. So it's all about improving methods, improving evidence, and then having an impact through improving decisions, and ultimately a benefit to patients as well. This slide just touches on the stakeholders, so I've really already spoken to that, and one of our aims is to bring everybody together. So ISPOR provides an opportunity for you as new early career researchers to engage with these different stakeholders and understand how your training will assist you in providing evidence. Ingrid already showed this slide, and of course we need a new pin now to represent your new student chapter, but there really is a very important global footprint for ISPOR. And of course, these are the key publications which you'll be familiar with, but Value in Health, for example, is a really important flagship journal which has a good impact factor, which is on the rise. And Value in Health Regional Issues is now also has an impact factor for the first time, and I think you can expect to see that increasing as well. So there are some vehicles there for publishing. Student networks, well, you're now part of it, so congratulations again. Having a student chapter means it gives you access into ISPOR. It means that you can take part in the webinars, have access to travel grants, awards and discounted membership and registration and taking part in the short courses and so on. There's also a new HEOR professional group, which may be of interest to you as well, recognising that the development of new professionals is super important, and as is the development of leadership within ISPOR. And ISPOR is really interested in developing new leaders and getting new, fresh thinking into the organisation. So there are opportunities there for you as well. There's a career centre which has its own web page, so if you haven't already had a look at that, do go and take a look. That will be of interest and relevance to you if you're coming up to completing your training. So just to say a little bit about other organisations and how ISPOR kind of fits in with those, IHEAR is a really important global organisation, professional association as well. And you can see I've just copied the mission statement and the website there. If you're not a member of IHEAR, it may also be of interest to you. It is solidly interested in health economics. So it's not necessarily focused on the HE part of HEOR, but nevertheless, there is a significant overlap between what IHEAR does and what ISPOR does in terms of that focus on economic evaluation and the methods underpinning it. So they're not mutually exclusive, they're kind of complementary, and I'm a member, for example, of both organisations. And similarly, there are health economics associations locally. I assume everybody on this call is in Australia, so you've got an Australian Health Economics Society. And that will be also potentially of interest to you. If you're in the UK, it's the Health Economics Study Group. And these are really good organisations to be part of to keep you up to date with the parts of health economics that aren't about economic evaluation, that aren't about health technology appraisal. Because I found that, you know, there are very different, distinct flavors of health economics. Health economics in North America, for example, tends to be more along the lines of understanding structure, conduct, performance, understanding the interaction between supply and demand, pricing, incentives, and behavior. Whereas in Commonwealth countries like Australia, UK, Canada, New Zealand, there's a much greater, health economics is much more focused on HEOR. So IHEAR is a really interesting and good organisation. And then here's another one, ISPOR. I'm not sure if you've heard of ISPOR, but it's another excellent organisation. If you're particularly interested in the bits of health economics which have to do with how you measure quality of life and how you value it, then ISPOR is an excellent organisation. They have fantastic conferences, and I think the intellectual content and rigour of these conferences is outstanding. So I find this a very good organisation as well. So again, it kind of overlaps a little bit with ISPOR, but they're all complementary and not mutually exclusive. And I'd say the one that I'm kind of, you know, least clear about in terms of how it's differentiated is HTAI, the Health Technology Assessment International. Its remit is kind of sounds very similar to that of ISPOR, except that rather than focusing on HEOR science, it kind of revolves around health technology appraisal. So it's just a slightly differentiated in terms of that focus on HTA as opposed to the applications of HEOR outside of health technology appraisal, but there's a lot of overlap. I've been to these conferences, they're you know, really useful. There's a lot of the same people go to those conferences as well and present there. And you can see that the mission statements similarly are, you know, they're quite close. ISPOR focused on HEOR science and its use in decision making. HTAI as does what it says on the tin. It's focused on HTA and the use of evidence to support HTA. So that's that. How many minutes have I got left, Kate?
.5 minutes, is that good?
Perfect. Yep, I can run through this. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about what's going on at ISPOR at a global level. And there's a lot going on. There always is at ISPOR. It's got, as well as that 20,000 members, there's a complicated network of committees and so on, and opportunities there for people to get involved in leadership. There was a new strategic plan that we updated and extended last year. And we outlined a number of key priorities. Of course, the biggest challenge this year, and it won't come as any surprise to you, has been managing ISPOR's key activities in the light of the pandemic and having to really rapidly, I'm not going to use the word pivot because it's always overused nowadays, but really rapidly just try and redesign everything that ISPOR does and turn it from quite a heavy reliance on huge face-to-face meetings, some of which have sort of over 5,000 people at them. Our ISPOR Europe meeting, for example, would typically have over 5,000 people at that conference, and doing everything online, virtual conferences, virtual committee meetings, and so on, and trying to get the pace of the work up. So it's been a really unusual year, as it has been for everybody. And I must admit that I did not anticipate in my final year as ISPOR's president having to make the decision to cancel one of our large international meetings, the first time in ISPOR's 25-year history that that's had to be done. And not a decision to be taken lightly, given the financial implications of that. So it's been a pretty challenging year. ISPOR's done well to adapt. And I'll just pull out a couple of things here that you might be interested in. I'll talk about the HUR science priorities. I'll talk about diversity. Those have been two things that I've been really focused on in my period as president, which ended last month. But just a couple of other things to highlight here is ISPOR's really enthusiastic about developing leaders. And when it comes to looking for people to go onto committees and looking for people to go on the ISPOR board of directors and also to develop new presidents, there's a whole chain of events that can happen there to support people into leadership roles and to help people to develop that experience and judgment that's required. So keep an eye out for opportunities that arise there. Let me focus just on those two things then, but then I can take questions on absolutely anything. ISPOR it's got a Health Sciences Policy Council, which is kind of comprised of all of the past presidents. So there tends to be a lot of grey heads around the table in that room. And it's tended to be a little bit reactive in the past. So it relies upon people coming up with ideas for, let's have a task force on this, or, oh gosh, here's a new policy that's happening in the US or in Europe. Let's react to that and set up a task force. And one of the things we wanted to do over the last year is to shift away from being reactive to being a bit more proactive and kind of owning the whole HEOR agenda and taking responsibility for developing it. So we came up with this new initiative to guide and inform what ISPOR does, to identify what the needs of healthcare decision makers are, but rather than reacting to it, to be sort of thinking ahead and to think, well, how do we want to shape methods now in order to meet the future evidence needs of healthcare systems and decision makers? And where are like the really big ideas? What are the breakthrough ideas, methods, and applications where HEOR can really push the science forward and result in better decisions and better outcomes for patients? So we started doing this in January this year, and we had a really ambitious timeline. It's kind of funny thinking back on it, but there was 6 of us flew to New York in January 2020. It just seems impossible to believe that that kind of thing even happened. It seems like a really long time ago and in a different world that we could all decide to just like meet up in New York. And since then, we've been working virtually, obviously, and all of this is coordinated by ISPOR's Chief Scientist, Dick Wilkie. I think I've already covered this, so let me skip to this, which is the way that we've actually done it. And the way that we did it was to survey the leadership groups. Now, I don't think the student chapter was in place in February 2020, so may not have actively been involved in this process. But every student chapter, every regional chapter, every committee of ISPOR, every task force, not just that's underway, but that's ever taken place, we went to all of them and we said, what do you think the top 10 really important research questions are that we should be asking as an organisation and developing the science in? And we received over 900 suggestions back on that. And then there was a process whereby the Health Science Policy Council and our small working group worked to kind of group these into themes. And we did that in such a way that we were checking the way that we grouped those thematically. And then we went through a process of sort of categorizing down those still further, trying to decide what the priorities were, coming to the right balance between specificity and sort of generality, which is actually quite difficult. And I think we're nearly there. The plan is that this will all be done by the end of the year. We're finalising literally tomorrow what these top priorities will be. We will then start working on a white paper which will go out for consultation and discussion with the wider membership. So probably an opportunity there for the student chapter to have some input to that. And by the end of this year, there'll be a final scientific agenda and white paper. And the idea is that all of this is going to help us to be a bit more proactive and a bit more sort of forward-looking when it comes to saying, not just reacting to ideas about new SIGs and task forces, but going, look, here's like a really massive gap, and we should be doing some work there. So that was all I had to say about that. Happy to take questions on that. And then just to comment, the other thing that I had a really big push on while I was president was around diversity, and the ISPOR had a bit of a reputation as having predominantly older white men speaking at conferences, which is, as well as meaning that we're missing out on a broad set of expertise, is also just a really bad look for a modern organisation. And so we've been making progress year on year in the percentage of speakers at our plenaries who are female. And I'd have to say that all of this is just in terms of gender at the moment, but we also have a diversity policy, which is about more than gender. And that will be what the focus going forward will be, to make sure that these achievements are replicated in all aspects of diversity. In terms of invited sessions, that's the sessions in our conferences where ISPOR itself reaches out to people and chooses the speakers. 100% of those sessions are gender diverse. And now I was really pleased that in the last conference of my presidency, we achieved a position where 77% of the submitted sessions, that's the issues panels and workshops, were also balanced between men and women, just 11% all male, and exactly balanced with 11% being all female. And the reason that was important was, even just comparing with last year, that's a really big improvement. We had nearly a third of the submitted abstracts in 2019, all male sessions. And yeah, and that was an improvement on the previous year. So there'd been this tendency to have a lot of all male panels at ISPOR, and I think that that was really important to address. I'm super happy that we've managed to address that, but I think this will take an ongoing commitment from all members when they're submitting abstracts, to remember to reach out to the membership generally, and not just to sign up your mates to give a talk at the conference. So last minute, just some really quick reflections from me on my experience as being the president of ISPOR, and I learned an awful lot from it. If any of you have an opportunity to get involved in leadership roles in ISPOR, I'd really encourage you to do it. It's got some great strengths as an organisation. It's very well managed. It has a very strong professional team based in New Jersey, just outside New York. It has an ability to really rapidly adapt and respond to changing circumstances and needs, as we learned during the course of this year. COVID-19 and the shift to virtual conferences was massive for ISPOR, not just in terms of the logistics of shifting conferences to a virtual setting, but financially as an organisation, the vast majority of ISPOR's revenue comes from those large face-to-face conferences. So rethinking through the business case and thinking about how conferences will run virtually, not just at a technical level, but how to make that run successfully and sustainably as an economic and financial business is important as well. And I think the future is looking rather hybrid, as a hybrid of virtual and face-to-face meetings, recognising the real value actually of virtual conferences to people that can't fly and don't have access to a big budget to fly to these exotic places. ISPOR's organisational culture, I'd have to say it was the first time that I've led an organisation that's been US-based. And there was a lot of learning in that for me about how to deal with different cultures. I'm a New Zealander. I've worked in Australia. I've worked probably most of my professional life in various places in Europe. The US for me was a real eye-opener, and it surprised me how different it was to act as a leader in a US-based organisation. So I learned a lot from that. There are both some real strengths of that, but also some real challenges in terms of affecting change and being candid and blunt without offending people. And I think there's also, to be honest, there's some real challenges for Antipodean leaders. And I never recognised that so starkly as when I shifted to Australia partway through my presidency. Most of my meetings were between 11 p.m. at night and 2 a.m. in the morning, and then frequently more meetings with ISPOR from 7 a.m. the following morning. And if you have a whole week of that, you're absolutely shattered at the end of it. So it really is very difficult, because you can't, even as president, expect all of your board of directors, all of your health science policy committee people and so on to readjust their timeframes just because you happen to be in Australia or New Zealand. I would say to all of you that it's really important having someone that's a champion for you and a mentor. I would never have dreamed of putting myself forward to be president of ISPOR. It would never have occurred to me. And it was really only because of my close colleague, Adrian Towles, at the Office of Health Economics, and Mark Scolfer, who's sort of been a close colleague for many years, and them approaching me and saying, you should really do this. And of course you can do it. And, we really need someone like you to do X, Y, or Z and to bring that to the leadership role. I would never have dreamed of it. And so if you haven't already got that person, you go and find that person or that set of people that are going to push you to do things that may make you feel really uncomfortable, but where you've got something really unique and good that you can offer to ISPOR. ISPOR will be all the richer from having your active involvement. And then just my final comment is the president's role is a lot more real than I'd imagined it would be. When you see it from a distance, when you see it from outside, and you see these kind of glossy talks that the president gives, it all looks rather ceremonial, and some of it is. And I feel really uncomfortable with some of that sort of ceremonial figurehead type role. But there's a lot more to it than that. And I was both amazed, but also quite pleased that there were so many occasions during the course of my presidency where there were really difficult decisions to make, and where you had to exercise judgment, and where you can see that you can make a real difference. Sometimes it's not easy, and it's like all of these things in life. You have to sometimes be prepared to make some people uncomfortable and some people unhappy, because not every difficult decision will make everybody happy. But you've just got to be really confident that you know what the right thing is, and what the right thing is for the members, and to be willing to have the courage of your own convictions. So there was a bit more of that involved in the presidency than I realised, but I think that's a very good thing. That's all from me. There's a couple of other slides, but they're all kind of quite glossy, and just, to say that there's some stuff on social media on ISPOR, but happy to take any questions from anyone about anything.
Fantastic, Nancy. That was such a wonderful talk. I really appreciate you coming and chatting to us about that. I've just got a quick question to start us off. So during your time as ISPOR president, you had a focus on equity, as you mentioned, and particularly gender equity in how you've presented that today. And there was a big jump in 2019. Can you just talk a little bit more about how you achieved that?
Yeah, it was very interesting. So there was a very helpful article in Pharmacoeconomics by Jacqueline Bouvy, and I'm sorry, I can't remember her Polish name.
Yeah, I read that.
Yeah, I was really pleased about that article, and we had some correspondence in advance pointing out the all-male panels issue. And the previous year, I had also been pointing it out, that I was very uncomfortable shifting into a leadership role in an organisation that had these all-male panels, because it was sending a terrible message to young women in the membership as well. And we had been aware of this for some time. So we set up something called Women in HEOR, and I'm not sure if you're familiar with that, but you can go and look it up on the ISPOR website. It was just a way of trying to really lift women in the organisation. So some of the practical things we did was, whenever I had an opportunity in front of an audience, I would say to people, don't put an all-male panel abstract in. Just don't do it. Like, just do not submit an abstract with all men on it. We'll knock it back. And in practice, we didn't. I was, if I'd had my way, I probably would have had a veto on it. And to be honest, it probably would have been the wrong thing, because people would have reacted very badly to having had a veto. So what we tried to do was much harder, which was to sort of just do cultural change. Just ask male members, trying to sort of raise awareness that having all male panels was very difficult to defend. Why there were not a single woman out of the 20,000 members wasn't an expert on that panel. And that was quite successful, I think. But also encouraging women to submit abstracts. And just as it might be of interest to you, so women are much more likely to submit one amazingly good abstract, but male colleagues are much more likely to submit 6 to 7 abstracts and just hope that 2 or 3 of them get accepted. And it was just fascinating when we looked at the numbers. You know, that's what happens. So the real lessons there for women, you know, don't be shy, stick those abstracts in. If they get rejected, it doesn't mean you're a bad person. You know, I think women do sort of have a slightly more, I want to do one perfect thing, rather than let's just stick lots of abstracts in. Yeah, so we had lots of strategies, really.
Fantastic, thank you. I've got a question from Michelle too. She says, thank you for the presentation, very insightful, and proud to be part of the student chapter. As an individual transitioning away from being a student to an early career researcher, what advice would you give for one to leverage organisations like ISPOR to build our academic careers?
Yeah, just get engaged. You're here in the meeting and you're asking a question, so you're doing all the right things. You know, just continue that. Come to the conferences, ask questions, get your name known, and just be active in the organisation, and take advantage of the fact that those conferences provide you with a ready-made audience of potential employers and potential senior colleagues. And I've gotten to know so many wonderful young colleagues over the last 10 years through, you know, being in a leadership role in ISPOR, and just having young people come up to me and making themselves known. So I've got a couple of people that I'm mentoring now that have just, you know, through real one-to-one relationships which have been forged in those meetings. So, you know, don't be shy. I know we're not meeting face-to-face nowadays, which is really such a shame, but you know, people on the board of directors and leadership groups really like being in contact with early career researchers. You know, you're the people that are going to be responsible for this whole area in future.
I've got a question, Nancy, from Tan. How do you think we can leverage and build advocacy for HEOR as an integral mentality for priority setting in Australia?
It's an interesting question. I mean, PBAC was one of the first health technology appraisal organisations internationally, I think, one of the first to mandate evidence we submitted to it. So there's a very long tradition of HTA within Australia. Having said that, I think there's still plenty of scope for methods development to strengthen and improve HTA, both via PBAC, MSAC and other organisations. more broadly than that, I suppose what I might see is a bit missing at the moment is that sort of whole system HEOR that I mentioned at the beginning of the talk. So I'm seeing a bit less of that in Australia. And I suppose in part that might be because the healthcare system has quite a complex mix of private and public on both the funding and the provision side. And one of the things that I've started to get really interested in, and when I say I'm interested in it, I mean I've got lots of questions, I don't know what the answers are. How do private payers, private insurance companies, for example, how do they make use of HTA? How do they decide when a new technology or a new surgical intervention, for example, it becomes part of the package of reimbursement? And to what extent is that determined by value for money and cost effectiveness as opposed to other considerations such as competition with other insurers, budget management, and the need to make profit? Or surplus in the case of a not-for-profit organisation. So I think there's a really interesting set of questions there globally that are relevant to Australia, very relevant to the US, relevant to any healthcare system that's mixed in that way, is this whole HEOR thing. How does the private sector make use of it? And I think the answer to that is not very much at the moment.
Fantastic, Nancy. I'm going to have to wrap it up there because we've got 1 minute to go. Tan, are you online to just finish up for us? You just need to take your mute off.
So yeah, thank you. Thanks, Nancy, and thanks everyone for being with us today. Really appreciate your talk, and yeah, we look forward to I guess trying to strengthen the group, and we do have a very short I guess a feedback questionnaire that we'll share through the chat box, just to get a brief idea of how the event went, and yeah, look forward to seeing you at a future event. And again, on behalf of the team, Nancy, thank you for your contribution to this presentation. It's really great to see the energy. I certainly feel the energy as well throughout the whole presentation as well. So thank you for that. So I'll just share that link with a very short review feedback. All right.
Fantastic.
I think that's it. So the results won't be, the results will be closed. So we'll collect all the information, and yeah, we'll work on what feedback we get, and we'll catch you at the next meeting.
Thanks so much, everybody. See you next time.
Bye.
Thanks, Nancy.
So I'm going to end this meeting officially, and I think that we can go elsewhere for our meeting.
What about the people going on the link?
Do you want me to send another Zoom link, or we just use this one?
What about the people that are still doing the link from the
right
Mentimeter?
No, I think fine, because I think just like, yeah, I think I'm going to end it and then move on to the next.
Okay. I'll send a new one.